All right, we're gonna try this out. Not really sure how this is gonna go, but um, all right. So this lecture is gonna be about the progressive era, um, which really builds out of many of the sort of negative effects that the middle class starts to experience as a result of industrialization, urbanization, and increased and immigration during the late 1800s. So, this sort of rough time period for this progressive era starts somewhere in the late 1800s and typically ends in 1919 or 1920 with the end of World War I. And sort of many people say 1919 just because sort of culmination of this is with women gaining the right to vote. All right, so if we look at who progressives were, um, they're mostly middle-class people, and especially middle-class people who lived in cities. And this is important because you can kind of see what progressives choose to focus on has a lot to do with who they are as people, their sort of socioeconomic position. We'll even talk about sort of like their religious beliefs and how their religious beliefs will have an impact on how the sort of progressive era unfolds. And then the way they choose to combat these problems it really is closely tied to who they were. If we kind of look at like why they were so committed to change, and this kind of ties the religious part is it's sort of ironic that their main motivation for change obviously is in no small part due to the fact of all of the political corruption caused by Gilded Age politics with more wealth in society. It's also caused by sort of many of the negatives with urbanization, with pollution, and we'll see some of that stuff. But I think one of the biggest motivators that especially like your book won't talk about is that a lot of this progressive movement actually has to do with the Third Great Awakening in America, which happened, depending on who you're talking to, really at the end of the Civil War, and in many ways you could probably tie it to a lot of like this sort of renewed emphasis on or interest in the afterlife and religiosity because of all like the death that America experiences during the Civil War, and really goes up to like World War I in the early 1900s. But the way that this ties into the progressive period is this Third Great Awakening. It has a lot to do with like Protestants' beliefs in the Second Coming, and what a lot of now obviously, but many Protestants really legitimately believe that in order for the Second Coming to occur, what they needed to do is to make the earth right for Jesus. And so a lot of these reforms that come about, no doubt, like I said earlier, are influenced by their sort of interactions with the world around them and what sort of changes are happening. But I think like a significant point that gets undersold is this religious component and how this sort of religiosity also helps inspire this change. If we look at sort of just like a list of what progressives target, you can see a lot of stuff there. You can just kind of go down the list here. And this is in no particular order of importance, but just kind of go down this. So if we look at issues, correct political machines, I think Tammany Hall is probably the best example of this. Hopefully you've sort of come across Tammany Hall in your readings, and how those sort of political machines like Tammany were used in big cities to sort of take advantage of voters and sort of manipulated city politics to enriching themselves. They're also going to go after trust and monopolies, which are virtually synonyms for each other, but mean the same difference. So trust or monopolies, I sort of put there like the best example of this in the early 1900s is Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller, the person who started Standard Oil, in the early 1900s. This was one of the richest people who ever lived. So it's a really good example of that. And a lot of the growth of trust monopolies has to do with industrialization that occurs in the late 1800s. Talk about inequalities in society. So we see huge growth in sort of gap between rich and poor, and progressives are going to be worried about that and the effects of that on society. They're going to be concerned with safety, and really when we talk about safety, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different things, because we'll see that like it's during this time that cities get their first police forces and firefighters, but it's also like worker safety too, and how worker safety will be a big part of this as the sort of effects of industrialization and the effects of factory work become, I don't want to say this, like it's not necessarily that you have more accidents, you just have better reporting of accidents, and it becomes, as newspapers start to become more prolific around America, it becomes something that really sensationalized news is report these big accidents and deaths and so on. Talk about city services, a lot of that kind of ties into safety, but we didn't talk about trash removal and sewer systems get put in most major cities. Even something that it's not mentioned there, but it does happen, is like Boston, for example, is the first city to get subway systems during this time period, so that's important. We'll talk a lot about women's suffrage later, and then the prohibition of alcohol, we'll talk a lot about that too. So, I mean, all that being said, I mean, I hope that you see that this is, you know, it's kind of hard to peg down like what a typical progressive was, and so our answer of just saying there's sort of middle class urbanites is kind of vague, but sort of necessarily vague, because progressives, depending on what they wanted to accomplish, really could be a vast number of different groups. All right, so the sort of interesting thing about progressives, and I think that like this would be really interesting to many of us as sort of current Americans, and that progressives honestly believed that the best way to make change was through the government. And that's important, and that's something that is maybe hard for us to conceive, just because of how sort of, when you look at average Americans' approval ratings of Congress, they're as low as they've ever been now. And so I think that sort of the common political views today are really corrupted by this belief that like government either doesn't do good or can, or inefficiencies are built in it. Like progressives would have had a completely opposite worldview, and so progressives, and I hope that you see this, is that they are trying to work within government to get government to be the mechanism for change, which I think is both interesting and we'll see whether that allows them to be more or less effective as we kind of go through this. If we sort of start going through some of these reforms, I think some of the other things that are really relevant here is that, and we'll see this on the sort of bottom here, is that progressives, like to start with, are going to try to make government much more democratic. And I think like a really interesting question to deal with, like the progressive era, is like the extent to which these reforms really bring sort of the reality of American politics more closely in line with like the ideals of our founders and the ideals of our Constitution and the American Revolution just in general. Because what we see is that like they're going to make significant changes that make government more democratic. Is that like through like an initiative is like a measure that's voted on by the people, and then they send it to lawmakers to either to make it a law or not. They created referendums, which a referendum is something that gets put on the ballot, and the voters decide whether it's going to become law or not. And so like I think those two things are really interesting ways to make legislation more democratic. One of the other big changes they make is with the 17th Amendment, which the 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of U.S. senators. And what that means is that um, for the first, I guess, 130 years of American politics, the way that U.S. senators were selected was that state senators would get elected to go to, say, like Jackson, for example, where our legislature meets. And so what then would happen is you'd have all these state senators that would get elected, and then in Jackson, once this group had been elected, that small group of state senators would select the two that were going to be the senators that got sent to Washington to be representatives of the state. And so what ended up happening is that you'd have these state senators that would get elected to these state legislators, and then there's a lot of corruption in the next sort of process, is that oftentimes the people that got sent from the state legislatures to the national, like, to Congress to be national U.S. senators, were the people in the state that had the most money, and they could bribe and people and buy votes, and there's all sorts of corruption in that process. And so what progressives did is they passed the 17th Amendment, where now when you go and vote eventually, is you'll vote directly for the people you want to be your state senators, and then you'll vote for people that you want to represent Mississippi on the national level. So that was an important change that made, at least in the short term, politics less corrupt. We look at some of the presidents. Today we're going to really talk about Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. We're going to jump over Taft, just because Taft doesn't have that big of an effect. But we'll talk a lot about Roosevelt's policies and Woodrow Wilson's policies. I think one of the things that's really interesting to do and to think about as we kind of go through this is, like, we know what progressives wanted, sort of on a generalized level, on a person-to-person level, and I think so. Like, the good question to ask yourself is, well, to what extent do, like, each of these presidents sort of align with progressive wishes and progressive reforms, and to what extent they really are progressive or not. So let's start with Teddy. So Teddy's a really interesting story, and we don't have time here to go into the sort of backgrounds here, but some of the relevant things is, like, Teddy sort of willingly signed up to go and fight in the Spanish-American War, which I'm sure was in your textbook, and he becomes a big war hero, and there's all sorts of stories about his doings, and I think so Teddy Roosevelt actually gets elected first as the vice president, and it's interesting because he gets elected vice president as a way for the Republican Party to kind of put him somewhere where he's going to cause the least amount of trouble for the Republican Party, because he's kind of known as a rebel rouser in politics, and he's sort of like a hellraiser. And sort of unfortunately, William McKinley gets assassinated, and suddenly Teddy Roosevelt is president. And what Roosevelt's presidency is most known for is that he's two things. One is that he greatly expands the power of the presidency. All right, and so basically no presidents so you have, like, the founders, obviously super important, and you have a big gap of presidents who are largely irrelevant, maybe outside of Andrew Jackson, and then you have a gap, and you have Abraham Lincoln, obviously, and then you have another huge gap from Abraham Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt, where many of these late 1800s presidents don't really do much. And Teddy Roosevelt really is, in many ways, by historians, is, like, considered the first modern president, because of how he starts to sort of build the importance and build the power of the presidency just as the office is itself. And so that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that, like, Roosevelt maybe is the first president that we can genuinely see tried to create policies that were purposely designed to protect ordinary people and to sort of give ordinary people an equal opportunity, an equal sort of experience of the American dream and American life. And I think you'll see that as you go through this. And I think the first best example of this is in 1902 when Roosevelt intervenes in this labor dispute between a coal mine and the miners. And traditionally, what had happened when there had been labor disputes between companies and workers, the government had always I shouldn't say that. The government had almost always, and I can think of like one, maybe two exceptions, but almost always the government had sided on the side of the business. And what Roosevelt does, which was interesting, and this is maybe the first time that it was strongly put as it is, but like Roosevelt basically goes to the owner of the coal mine and says, like, if you don't realistically meet these demands that are put in place by these workers and you're not willing to compromise, then what's going to happen is the government's going to take over the coal mine. And so he basically uses the power of the government to force the owners of the coal mines to come to a sort of reasonable agreement to limit workers' hours so that they put it. I don't remember the specific. I think what's kind of silly now is I think the cap that the government put on there was like that miners could only like at a maximum work like 14-hour days. So we're still talking about a sort of vastly different work environment, but it's still just it's important because of the fact that the government does sort of step in to make sure that businesses are treating workers in a sort of reasonable way, which I think maybe we would say that still is a 14-hour day in a coal mine, maybe unreasonable, but lots changed in 100 years. The other thing that Roosevelt was known for, as far as like the way that he interacted with big businesses, is that he was known as a trust buster, and so Roosevelt's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in the early 1900s. They're really going to pass two antitrust acts, or like when you say antitrust, you're really talking about like anti-monopoly acts. What's interesting about Roosevelt though is like he didn't necessarily think that like monopolies were inherently bad. He thought that like just being a monopoly in itself isn't a bad thing, but like that there were certain monopolies in America that were sort of taking advantage of their power and in a sort of unjust way to extract too much money out of average. They were taking advantage of their position and taking advantage of Americans. And so like what's important about Teddy Roosevelt is he doesn't necessarily think all monopolies are bad or all trusts are bad. It's just that he went after certain businesses that he thought were taking advantage of their position, which is going to be different than, say, Woodrow Wilson. We'll get to that later. The other thing Teddy Roosevelt does, he also passed the Hepburn Act, which gave the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, the power to enforce price limits on what railroad companies could charge farmers for shipping costs. And that was one of the big things about the populists, if we go back to the populists, is that Roosevelt's going to pass this act that gave the government power to say, like, for X amount of goods, you can charge this maximum price. And that was a big thing for farmers because of how it sort of leveled the playing field in as far as like negotiating prices and gave farmers a way to in a sort of reasonably priced way get their crops from farm to market. Some of the other things we'll look at with Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to pass two really important acts. One was the Meat Inspection Act, which was tied directly to a book that he read. It was called The Jungle. It was written by Upton Sinclair. I don't have that on the PowerPoint slide, but hopefully the book mentions something about this, is that Upton Sinclair writes a really, really, really important book in American history called The Jungle, which basically is this expose on um, what sort of American meat packing facilities and food production facilities were like in the early 1900s. Um, Pretty gruesome stuff. I mean, I think in like one of the chapters he talks about how he witnesses like mice and rats getting sort of grinded up with the I think the beef that he was talking about and how that gets packaged in there. I think there was even one thing where he talks about how this worker was working like a meat grinder, and the worker gets his finger stuck in the meat grinder and loses part of his finger, and the meat company didn't like stop production. They just let the human flesh get mixed in with what they were producing, and it goes out for sale. So it's pretty bad stuff, and sort of in reaction to that, the American public goes crazy, and Roosevelt read the book, and because of that, he writes the Meat Inspection Act, which is really important in sort of providing for like government offices to go and to check health standards and create health standards for companies to follow. And then the second thing that's sort of related to that is the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was important because like what the Pure Food and Drug Act did was it made companies label what was in their products, and then also like prosecuted people for lying about like what was in their products, so you couldn't claim it was this and it was really something else. And so and obviously, I mean, that has a huge effect on sort of American consumers. If we jump over to Woodrow Wilson now, and I'm sure your book will go into more details. I mean, those are some of like the highlights as far as Teddy Roosevelt goes and some of the big like progressive reforms that he does. So Woodrow Wilson is in some ways, I would say, equally progressive. In some ways, I'd say he's not. At the end of this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about sort of some race issues that are still sort of ever present in America during this time period, and how they actually in some ways become worse. But some of the things that Woodrow Wilson does, he had like a called New Freedom Plan, which was supposed to increase government regulation on corporations and increase government regulations on trusts in order to try to create a much more equal society as far as using sort of wealth to funnel money back into society and government to make better schools, to work on infrastructure, to build hospitals, do all that kind of stuff. I think the other thing is that he creates the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission, in 1914, which was a sort of government agency that is going to sort of constantly monitor businesses, not only just to prevent monopolies, but also like a lot of the sort of changes that Roosevelt does, kind of building on that with like false advertising and dishonest labeling and stuff like that. If we look at like during this time period, okay, there's going to be a group of journalists that are called muckrakers, and this group, we've already talked about Upton Sinclair, would be included in this group, the guy that wrote The Jungle. You see a couple more in front of you, like Lincoln Stevens, The Shame of Cities. He talks about how sort of dirty, corrupt city politics had become. Talk about like Ida Tarbell in the History of Centerville, like basically just writes about how the like Standard Oil manipulated local economies to like take advantage of people and to put like their competitors out of business so that they could get monopolies over certain areas. But basically, like this becomes a really popular way for writers to make money, to be honest with you. And so a lot of people get into this like investigative journalism, and it becomes kind of like a fad during this time period. And a lot of it's really important because, like I said, like Upton Sinclair's Jungle has an important effect on society. this next guy you see here, Jacob Riis, um, wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and he also did like slideshows. So he would go around New York City and he would do these like almost like it was he would show pictures, and this is really important because like you need to understand like in early 1900s America, cities were so spread out, like cities like New York, and were so heavily segregated by class, is that you're talking about rich people that really would have had no idea how poor people lived, and that Jacob Riis going into these poor areas and taking pictures and writing about these things. I mean, you see in this picture right here, it's like these kids are playing on the street, and there's a dead horse that's been rotting there on the street, and so he'll go around, he'll take pictures like this and say, well, like these kids are living in these areas where the nasty conditions. There's no one to clean up the city. You'll talk about crime. You'll talk about how he goes in and takes pictures of the shanties that they lived in that were called tenement housing, and how you had like 10, 12 people living in probably the size of rooms that are as big as your closets probably at your house. So Riis has a really important effect on America as well. We already talked about Sinclair, so we're going to jump this slide. Talk about settlement houses. Jane Addams started what essentially became called like settlement houses. Jane Addams' house was called the Hull House in Chicago, but these things spread all over America from there. And what they were is like progressives would start these groups that would create these. I don't necessarily want to call them. Like an orphanage is not totally correct, because a lot of times this was a mixture of like kids and adults in these homes, and it wasn't technically just for the poor. It was more about, I mean, these like the essential thing was like these immigrants, like you want to, and many times like the overlap between immigrants and poor is virtually the same thing for all intents and purposes at this time. Is that it would take these people, these poor immigrants, and teach them basic skills. It would teach them English. They would give them they would Americanize them. And then that's sort of like what they call these things, like Americanization programs. And so like it taught them to fit in, and it gave them skills that they could utilize to sort of not be drains on society. And so like this is sort of like the best and the worst of progressivism, because they see that they want to help these immigrants, which is a good thing, but they also like are trying to mold these immigrants into being like basically identical reflections of who they were as people, and so they're trying to both help them assimilate, but in a manner in which that they sort of deem best, and to try to get them to be like themselves, and sort of take their Irish out of them, or take the Italian out of them. One of the other big changes, obviously, is women's suffrage. Women's suffrage the push for women's suffrage really starts after the Civil War in the late 1800s. So when African American men get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment in I believe 1865, it really like women start to push more and more, and I think honestly like that's one of the things that has always surprised me about American history, and something that always I think is important to note, is that we should know, at least in some small way, and we're going to talk about this later actually, is like how racist America really was at this time. But like white men give black men the right to vote before they do white women. And I think that that's an important sort of point to make when we talk about women's suffrage, because we kind of take it for granted that, yeah, like women vote just like men, and they should. the vast majority of people during this time period, um, especially in the late 1800s, would have disagreed with that wholeheartedly, and it's only through a really strong concerted effort uh, by women's suffrage groups and women's suffrage leaders that they start to really change um, men's minds, and I think some of that also has to do with World War I, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Um, so if you look at women's suffrage, I think one of the interesting things also about this is like this is a great example of how states' rights can result in things that are positive and like that a lot of times we hear this sort of like discourse about states' rights sort of framed in a negative that when people argue for states' rights, it's oftentimes, well, most oftentimes been in history that when individuals are arguing for more states' rights, it's oftentimes to like discriminate against people or to take rights away from certain groups of people. This is one of those unique cases where I think like states having the rights to experiment with different things really resulted in a positive for America. And so what we see is that like women's suffrage really starts in Western states, and as it becomes more of a norm in the West and across the Midwest, is that it really puts more pressure on these sort of important political centers in cities in the East, on the East Coast, to make this a national movement. So by the time we get to 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed. It's a really easy way to remember that. And so the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and it's in the 1920 presidential election that women vote for the president for the first time. I'm going to kind of skip that. One of the other things, and this is kind of tied to like women's rights movement as well, is that progressives also pushed for temperance, which is basically just like prohibition movement, which was to outlaw alcohol in the United States. And so this is one of those things that I think had a lot to do with increased immigration. I think this also had a lot to do with like anti-immigration, like sentiment in America. It's like I said, it's also like a women's issue, because what we see during this time period is that alcohol consumption increases greatly across the United States, and I think like one of the things that you need to understand is like we're not living in a day and age where like there's sort of legal sort of qualifications of like child abuse and sort of abuse of significant others, and so like drunk men became a big social problem, not only because of men would get off work and go drink their paychecks away, which is an economic issue, but then when they would get home they'd beat their kids and their wife, and it becomes sort of a big rallying cry, and women don't want a city full of drunks. And also like understand like that there's a religious thing to that too. Remember, we're going all the way back to like this Third Great Awakening where they want to sort of purify society for just Jesus to come back, and so it all sort of plays into that, which they ultimately are successful. So just to note that like they get the 18th Amendment passed, which banned the sale production of alcohol the same year that the 19th Amendment was passed. Progressives are also going to be really successful in reducing child labor and improving school enrollment. So you can see like those two charts there on the screen. Enrollment in schools consistently goes up through this time period, and the amount of kids working in factories declines incredibly over this period as well. So, and those two things are really importantly tied together, is that progressives are trying to get kids out of factories and into schools. You need to understand one of the things, and I don't want to be sort of pessimistic about school here in saying this, but I do want to make sure that you're aware of this, because I mean this is historically is true, and one of the big things about getting kids into schools is that schools are a good way to indoctrinate kids, and that if you look at like this time period where like Americans become very concerned about sort of like these huge amounts of immigrants that they view as pouring into the country and sort of polluting this sort of American ideal that's been created of, like a white Protestant America, is that like schools can be used to like teach kids English and to get rid of their native languages and to teach them how to dress appropriately and how to fit into American society, and to indoctrinate them into be, forgetting that they're Irish or German or Italian, and becoming American. And so, like, part of this, and again, that just kind of shows like that this progressivism has a really um, like conflicted sort of view in history, because they're accomplishing a lot of good things, but the motives, and a lot of times, and we'll talk about eugenics later, which is get to that when we get to that. But the motives a lot of times were not necessarily coming from the best place. If we get to some like the factory reforms, I think like the biggest sort of impulse for this comes after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory. Essentially what you have happening here is that these women were working at this clothing production facility, and the boss was concerned that the women were taking too many breaks, and so that what he did is he started locking the women in there for long periods at a time, and a fire breaks out, and they get basically trapped in this burning room on one of the top floors of this building, and they start jumping out of the window because they're burning alive. And it's right, you can see right here, I'm going to flip over, is that like women literally were jumping out into the streets of New York and dying on the street, and it's front page of the papers. And it's really after this that we start to see that like progressives start to really focus on worker safety laws and like changing it so that certain like safety features had to be included, like fire exits, started putting like fire extinguishers, and we're not anywhere near like the sprinkler systems in buildings or anything like that, but like all of that is sort of like stems from this one big incident that becomes like this big deal. 150 women die in this fire. I sort of alluded to this earlier, just a couple minutes ago, is with the eugenics movement, and I did want to bring this up because I don't know if they even talk about this in your book, but eugenics becomes a big deal during the progressive era, in what people become obsessed with is like this purifying society, and they start, and it's also like coincides with like a growth in scientific knowledge about humans and in our bodies and all this kind of stuff. And so what eugenics was all about is like people wanted to like study like human traits and figure out like why some people were this way and why some people were like essentially like trying to attribute certain human traits to certain like characteristics, either personality wise or athleticism, or I mean even they would think of things as like certain people were like disposed to like being criminals, or like promiscuous. And so like they started to study these characteristics, and they started coming up with like these sort of false scientific beliefs about, like this is the reason why like certain people are criminals, or this like Irish people tend to be this, or Jewish people tend to be that, or and so what they try to do is like create these laws for like racial purity, and they try to like get these sort of like bad characteristics out of human populations. And so what we see is like it's really kind of scary stuff, is that you see on this map here how many states had passed sterilization laws in the United States during this period. And what that meant is that like they would go around, and if you were a criminal, if you were promiscuous, like you had kids out of wedlock, if you were mentally retarded, if you were physically handicapped, if like you had any sort of like negative trait, they would sterilize you. They would prevent you from being able to have kids, and they're trying to sort of purify American society through not letting these traits get passed through generations, which is important because I mean, like, this obviously is a really negative thing in American history that doesn't get talked a lot about. And this also has a really big impact on Hitler. So, like, Hitler actually studied California's eugenics laws and a lot of his like racial purification programs that he placed in Germany leading up to World War II. These next couple slides are just like, I'm going to kind of go through them somewhat quickly. Just long lists of reforms that progressives make. So if you want to like go through and pause this or whatever and write these down, because I'm just going to click through them. But it is an impressive list, right? So like you see all of this kind of these acts that were passed during this time period and reforms that were made in American life. If we look at some of like the overarching things here, this, like, the progressives, we said, have sort of a mixed legacy. A lot of it has to do with like the motivations of them. But I think it would be silly to say that they weren't like awfully successful in attacking many of the issues that they sort of deemed that were most pressing in American life, and sort of they deemed like the biggest problems with sort of giving sort of all Americans sort of like an equal, was, as Teddy Roosevelt said, like, hey, you wanted to give all Americans a square deal, a fair deal. And so I would say that you'd have to say that they were successful. I mean, you can make an argument to sort of what extent they were successful, but certainly I think it would be wrong to sort of dismiss the changes that they make. And we'll come back a lot of this because a lot of like the reforms that are made during the Great Depression with Franklin Delano Roosevelt would sort of build off a lot of these ideas that were sort of initially put forward in the progressive movement. The next thing that I want to talk about is, and there was not really a good place to place this because it kind of falls in a couple different chapters, but I just wanted to mention it here because we're gonna come back to this a whole bunch of times. So when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance in a couple days, in the 1920s, when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement in like 2 weeks. But this obviously is also just really important as Mississippians, talking about race relations, and how it's really actually this interesting thing if you look at sort of how race relations develop after the Civil War, is that they actually get better for a while, and then they get much, much worse. So like I think that's an important question to ask yourself, is like, does moving forward in time always mean progress? Because I think we have this sort of false equivalency built from taking horrible history classes, that like, history is this sort of constant story of like progress and society getting better, and I think that's a big lie. And so, and this is like one of the best examples of that that I can sort of give you in the course of our class. But I think there are many, many, many examples in history where I could show you like this is unfortunately more common than you think, where things don't necessarily progress. It's not a constant progression and advancement in history where things always get better. So if we talk about race relations here, a lot of this is going to build around the Jim Crow South, but we'll talk about some other things too. Where I want to start is really like the problem of racial slavery. I think this is somewhere that's important to start, just because I don't think a lot of people build this in their brains, is that many, many, many societies in human history have had slavery, and obviously slavery is wrong, but like America wasn't unique in that. What we were unique in the fact was that like our system of slavery was built on race, and that when the Civil War is fought over slavery, and the Civil War ultimately ends on the side of the North winning and slavery ending, is, you in order for people to start to justify like why they had slaves, they had to eventually come to the conclusion, well, the reason we have slaves is because God created white people and black people differently, and that white people were meant to sort of rule over black people. And so like as Southerners try to find ways to justify that and use race to justify it, once slavery ends, you still have these sort of false notions of racial superiority that are sort of embedded into the psyches of Southerners, and really, I think, like have a sort of tangible effect on all of American. We'll talk a lot about this today. Like racism isn't a Southern problem; it's an American problem. But like the problem is that once the Civil War is over and slavery is over, like the beliefs that blacks are inferior sticks, and that really is like the problem. If we look at sort of like the end of Reconstruction, so from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1877, you see this sort of interesting period where like blacks are in America are actually going to, like, their position in politics and in economics and society just in general is going to improve. But it's also going to be a period where we see like huge increases in domestic terrorism. So we see groups like the Ku Klux Klan get created in order to sort of violently put down sort of blacks who are pushing for rights. I sort of have this example in here where like just in one summer in just one state in Louisiana, over 1,000 blacks were murdered by whites, which that's what's documented. I put that up there and sort of knowing that like if that was what was documented, it probably actually was a lot higher than that. And so, and what's interesting about that is we look at that and it's like that was like Northern troops were still in Louisiana at that time during Reconstruction, and we talk really in depth about Reconstruction. Just remember, like, Civil War ends. The federal government has a plan to like bring Southern states back into the Union. Part of that is like Southern states have to do certain things to be sort of allowed back into the Union, and Northern troops were put in Southern states to try to enforce these things. Now, a lot of this gets greatly overblown. Just read this interesting article about how the actual number of troops in Northern troops in Southern states was incredibly small. They didn't really do much, but it's just important to note that like this is both a time of like African Americans, black people in America are you're going to see increased numbers of for the very first time, we're going to have black politicians getting elected to Congress. Start to see black businesses prop up, schools, all this kind of stuff as in the sort of wake of the Civil War. And I think the most important is that we actually see, we see a couple things really important. I'm actually going to jump forward and then jump back. Talk about the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment. Obviously, I shouldn't have to say, like, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. You all should know that. The 14th Amendment is really important because the 14th Amendment, what it essentially did was it made states give every person, every citizen, the rights that were embedded in the Bill of Rights. So before the 14th Amendment was passed, there's this really ironic situation where like the federal government had its laws and rights that the federal government was going to give citizens, but the states didn't have to follow that. So like the states could create their list of rights that they deemed that people had. So like like a Mississippian would have different rights when dealing with the Mississippi government than it would with the federal national government. And so the 14th Amendment gets rid of that. It says, all states have to give every citizen of their state the same rights that were embedded in the U.S. Constitution. And really what this is like an amendment passed by sort of northern based Congress that essentially was like, hey, Southern states, black people are citizens now. You have to give them all of the rights that were embedded in the Bill of Rights. And then the 15th Amendment was passed. The 15th Amendment gave African men the right to vote. Super important. And then we sort of jump backwards, and talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1875. I think that this is really super important because this is essentially like Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Martin Luther King fights sort of diligently for, is essentially the same Civil Rights Act that was passed 90 years earlier by sort of a Northern Congress, and it basically was like Civil Rights Act 1805 is that it's illegal to exclude blacks from any sort of public venue, which when we get to Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, that's exactly what it does. The problem here is, though, is that the Supreme Court in 1883 ruled that this act was a non-constitutional act of Congress. And so this is like, for me, this is like one of the big what-ifs in history, is if the Supreme Court would have allowed the Civil Rights Act to go on, how different, the next 90 years would have been for African Americans. So jumping forward again. If we look at just sort of segregation, we'll talk a lot about Jim Crow laws. Hopefully you know what Jim Crow laws are from other classes in Mississippi history maybe. But Jim Crow laws were laws that forced segregation. So Jim Crow, and this is the difference between sort of like the racism that we see in the North and racism that we see in the South. And it's not perfect, it's kind of a generalization. But largely segregation in the North was, and discrimination and racism, a lot of it was just like, it was, people just knew about it, it was there, and it was present, but it wasn't written into laws. Whereas like, obviously when it largely left it a choice. What's interesting about the Jim Crow laws is basically forced segregation. So like individuals didn't have choices, like blacks and whites were going to be segregated, and if you didn't segregate, you were breaking the law. The sort of legal justification for segregation comes from a Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Plessy v. Ferguson was basically the case was a man sued a train company for having white and black train cars and trying to segregate where you sat on a train. He sued the government, the Supreme Court said like that segregation was actually legal as long as like the separate facilities were equal. And so like basically from 1896 moving forward, Southern states are able to use like this court case to say like, oh, we can segregate bathrooms, we can segregate movie theaters, we can segregate restaurants, we can segregate schools, we can do all this stuff. And this whole like separate but equal becomes a big sham. I mean, they become separate and very rarely are they ever anywhere close to equal. So if we look at voting rights, segregation becomes a big part of Southern society, and really Northern society in some ways, but to a lesser extent. But voting rights become a big issue too, and I'll show you why in a second, because if we look at this, many of these Southern states, the sort of racial proportions of their populations, I mean, in Mississippi, for example, there were more black people than there were white people, right? And if you look at this chart on this list, I mean, this is why voting becomes so important, because in many of these states, like, the difference between white and blacks were pretty equal, and like I said, in some of these states, there are more black people than white people, so voting rights become really, really important. And so, like, states start passing poll taxes so that, like, you had to pay to vote, which obviously affected poor black people and poor white people, and so that's a way of not only being sort of like racist, but it's also a way of being classist. They had literacy tests, so you had to be able to read and write, and oftentimes these literacy tests also, like, not only did you have to be able to read and write, but you'd come into the office and they'd give you the U.S. Constitution, and you'd have to like write up a summary of how and why the U.S. Constitution came into being and what certain amendments meant and all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't just as simple as you sort of think it was. And oftentimes these literacy tests, you can go in and you can look at sort of recordings from this time, like a number of people that took literacy tests, almost every single one of people that took literacy tests were black. And so like what we can see from that is that, that these literacy tests were going to be given to black people really exclusively, and probably a lot of white people that couldn't read or write as well, and or were undereducated and weren't being sort of given these tests and prevented from voting in the same way. I also just grandfather clauses, which is very simple. It just said like, hey, if your grandfather voted, or you could only vote if your grandfather had voted. Which, I mean, obviously for black people, many of their grandfathers were at that point had been slaves, and so like it prevented black people from being able to vote. And I think this last one is really important with violence and intimidation. We're going to talk a lot about this, but if you go and look back in some of the worst sort of examples of this, I mean, even in Mississippi, there's literally police records of white men going and basically shooting black men in the face with shotguns in Mississippi in front of courthouses that when they were standing in line to register to vote, and nothing was ever done about it. And so like because of sort of willing violence and sort of willingness for police not to prosecute, violence becomes probably like the biggest sort of cause of the suppression of black voting. The Supreme Court also plays a role in this. So like Williams versus Mississippi, the Supreme Court ruled that states could use literacy tests in voting. And I mean, the Supreme Court said that tests stopped illiterate blacks from voting the same as whites, and there was no like racial discrimination happening, which is, if you look at that sort of quote there, that was, I want to say that was from like the Mississippi governor at that time, or maybe it was like the Attorney General of Mississippi at that time. But I mean, everyone knew what it was for. And I think it's during this time period that we really see, like, ironically, like racism gets worse during the progressive period. I think a lot of this has to do with eugenics and like people trying to study race scientifically to try to find like an explanation for like why races are different and like how to best sort of respond to different races and how to treat different races. And I mean, like I have an example here. Like, I mean, if you look at like progressive New York and how like New York is one of these sort of like hearts of like the progressive reforms, and like in 1906 the Bronx Zoo put like an African man on display in the monkey section. So like literally people would go to the zoo to see like a black person living in with the monkey. So like when we start talking about, like I was someone earlier with like how like this progressive period has this really sort of like mixed legacy, like this is a big part of that. Same thing with Woodrow Wilson. I think the simple fact that like one of the main roads through Jackson is called Woodrow Wilson, it is named after Woodrow Wilson is crazy to me, because like Woodrow Wilson is openly despised people of color. A lot of people say that Woodrow Wilson actually belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Now that's not as that hasn't been definitively proved, but through certain things, I mean, some historians have postulated that he was part of the Ku Klux Klan. I think if you look at this, like Woodrow Wilson's going to segregate our national government, so he's going to, well, I should say resegregate our national government, because the government was segregated, and then after Civil War it was desegregated. Woodrow Wilson resegregated the whole thing, and so like throughout our country, like blacks were either segregated or just openly dismissed from government positions. He's also the president that sent U.S. troops overseas into colored countries more than any other president in our history. So like just willingly dismissed the fact that like colored nations had a right to sovereign borders, and sort of was an ardent believer in white supremacy and like this idea that like white America had a right to like go wherever they want, do what they want in other countries. Obviously, you know about the Ku Klux Klan. I don't need to talk a lot about this. I just will note that during the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan reaches its biggest sort of enrollment as far as like percentage of the population. during the 50s. I think they actually have more people, but it's a less percentage of the population. So like there were 3 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. There was also a Supreme Court justice. There was a member of the KKK too. And I mean, obviously, you know all about this stuff. Lynchings, and I talked about purposeful killings. I don't have to say a lot about that. I mean, you can look at this picture in the bottom left and see how horrible these things were, and how these become sort of public, events where people would go and watch these people being killed, and no one would do anything about it. And how powerful that becomes as a way to like get black people to act in certain ways, because people are being like people that ruffle feathers and people that get in the way are being killed and nothing's being done about it. So black people very quickly learn, like, hey, if you want to stay alive, you just keep your mouth shut, your head down, and you do what white people want you to do, or you end up dead. Which, I shouldn't have to tell you how messed up that is. I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot, actually, is race riots that break out in the early 20s and throughout the World War I. And how, like, we literally, in many cities across America, like, we have, not for long periods of time, obviously, but for, like, in certain instances, for a couple days at a time, you'll have, like Chicago, for example, like, the white part of Chicago and the black part of Chicago literally go to war with each other. I'll give the example of, like, Tulsa, and, like, white people in Tulsa hop into planes with sticks of dynamite, and they go and they blow up, like, the black part of town. They're literally dropping sticks of dynamite from planes onto sort of blacks' homes and businesses. And so, like, the point I'm trying to make is that, again, like, racism is, and we're going to talk about this next week actually later this week with the Harlem Renaissance, is that, like, racism is getting worse in America. And I think it's important to sort of ask ourselves, well, like, why is that happening? Like, what effects does that have? Just to kind of wrap up some of these things, we're going to talk about the Great Migration later, because we're talking about it and sort of how it fits in with World War I, but you should understand that in response to a lot of this, like, violence in the South, there's a huge migration of African Americans out of the South to large northern cities. So places like Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. There's this huge migration of black people to these cities because they're getting away from this violence, and it's also part of, like, a lot of this happens during World War I, where as more and more men go over to fight in the war, black men are moving north to fill the void left in these factories and to help sort of American companies produce more goods. We're going to come back to this. I'm going to skip over this. I mean, we're at an hour and 3 minutes. I'm going to come back to this because this is going to tie in perfectly with talk about, like, 1960s civil rights movement, and how, like, there's really by that point, there's two different sort of thoughts that had emerged over, like, how blacks would gain more rights. And so you have sort of like the Booker T. Washington approach, which is, just give it time, work within the system, work your way up. And that's really like the Martin Luther King Jr. approach, I kind of like to put it. And then the other thing is, like, the other guy that was really big during this time was, like, the W.E.B. Du Bois, which he kind of takes, like, the Malcolm X approach, which is like, like, the Constitution clearly says that, like, black people have the same rights as white people, and, like, we shouldn't be waiting for anything. The Constitution's very clear, and we need to be fighting for better treatment and more rights. And so, like I said, we'll come back to that. And then, the last thing that just sort of note about Du Bois is when they start the NAACP. So that's Progressive Era, and then sort of race relations within the Progressive Era and how they change. Make sure you check your email. Like I said, those reading comprehension questions, you should be able to, like, look at that list, and after reading and listening to this, you should be able to answer those questions. And if you can't, then then you need to go back through it and make sure that you're answering these, because a lot of them are pretty closely tied to the reading questions for your reading quizzes, and also just, I mean, these are the big things that I'm saying, like in the study of this topic, these are the things you need to know. So let me know if you have any questions. Hope this helps.